Tim Hague reads books. Political diaries can be turgid and self-serving, or they can be witty and revealing. Chris Mullin's diaries are firmly in the second category. The final volume, A Walk on Part, is brilliantly insightful, satisfyingly indiscreet, tender and tough, and marvellously resonant for today's politics. Chris had a front row seat on the circus that was New Labour. Tim met Chris at his publisher's offices in London and talked about the historic landslide election of the Labour government in 1997, Rupert Murdoch, lost leaders, and why Chris has a black and white television in his London flat.
This is Tim Hague Reads Books, and my book this time is A Walk on Part by Chris Mullin, which is the third volume of Chris Mullin's political diaries. I'm with Chris in the offices of his publisher, Profile Books. You were MP for Sunderland South from 87 to 2010, and if I'm honest, I mainly knew you for two reasons before the publication of the diaries, which was the books, the most famous of which is A Very British Coup that was turned into a TV series written by Alan Plater, wasn't it?
The screenplay was, yes, I wrote the book.
You complain about that in the diaries, that somebody's referred to it as Alan Plater's A Very British Coup. And I thought, yeah, that's about... Because I met Alan Plater once, and he said to me, all writers are thieves. Well, Chris
he did a very good job with my novels, I'm not complaining.
But also we know you, or I knew you most, as a campaigner against miscarriages of justice, which was, I think, your what made you most well known in Britain.
The Boeing of 6, the Guildford 4,
and the Carl Bridgewater
and
ones
the Carl
as well.
Bridgewater case.
I read the first volume of your diaries, A View from the Foothills, when it came out, loved it to bits, and that one was your years as a junior minister for Tony Blair. And now we get the beginning. Political diaries come out in a strange order, like Star Wars films. The book starts off, I think, on the very first page with the death of John Smith. Is that a pivotal moment in British politics? How different would things have been if he had not died?
Well, I think Labour would still have won in 97. I certainly think that. Not by the same margin, but comfortably. Smithy was very conservative with the small c, cautious. So some things would have changed for the better. There'd have been a bit more, a bit of basic social justice. There'd have been a minimum wage and perhaps the tax credits and all that sort of thing. But he wouldn't have been radical in the sense that Blair was, nor would he wouldn't have made some of the mistakes that New Labour made either. There'd have been no love affair with rich men. Or with Rupert Murdoch. Yes, he wouldn't have made the trip to Hayman Island to keep Rupert Murdoch happy. So it would have been different. He wouldn't probably have gone to such lengths to invest in education and health on the same scale as Blair and Brown eventually did either. But the other big thing, of course, if Smithy had been leader in 2003, nor would he have signed us up to the Iraq War. I think we can be fairly sure about that.
That might have been a good thing.
It would have been a very good thing.
There's a sort of a slight theme of lost leaders in this. The other figure who is largely, he's never mentioned these days, who's almost a lost leader, is Robin Cook, who died in the course of the government. I wanted to ask you, do you think he was a busted flush, though, by the time he died?
No, I think he probably would have been invited back into a Gordon Brown government, even though he didn't get on particularly well with Gordon Brown. But as it happened, he died at the height of his powers, when his prestige and credibility were at their absolute highest, and so he'll be remembered with honour for forever.
Why were you not the kind of politician who does get to the top? You're very smart, you've got enormous integrity, you're a capable operator, and yet there was always that sense, you always had the sense that they were never going to promote you to the very big jobs, and I think that was the sense of the
well, I was on the wrong side in the... I'm sorry, no, I'll take that again. I was on the losing side in the civil war that rent the Labour Party in the late 70s and early 80s.
In
so my
1995,
card was pretty much marked from that
you
time
wrote
onwards.
that you thought that Labour would have been in a better position if they'd had Tony Benn as leader than they were having not done. Do you still
I think they
that?
still have lost the 83 election even if Tony Benn had been leader, but by a much lesser margin. And I think Thatcher would have been opposed ideologically and consistently from the outset, which she wasn't for much of the 80s because Labour was preoccupied with its own internal affairs. But probably, since the tide of history was against us, I'm not sure that Benn would have formed a government even in 87.
I mean, there was a Labour awkward squad, the sort of Tam Diel and Frank Field and that crowd. But that really wasn't you. You were not awkward squad. You had a much more constructive approach.
Well, my approach became more constructive. I mean, initially, when back in the late 70s, early 80s, things were quite fraught, and there was really a very clear division between left and right. But by the mid-90s, when we'd lost 4 general elections in a row, it was Tony Blair's opinion, and it was mine too, that we couldn't even afford to take a little punt on the outcome of a 5th election, and it would therefore be good if we all pulled in the same
I think he had a point.
general direction. And the other great message of Blair, I think, was that you can't hope to form a government unless you occupy a fair swathe of the middle ground, the scope for how much you should go for. We don't need to mop up every last Daily Mail reader, but you do need the middle ground. And that's, Blair's great achievement was to drag Labour kicking and screaming onto the middle ground and keep it there.
And we forget, well, actually, no, we don't forget. I can clearly remember before the 97 election which with the majority of 178 and the landslide, it was not obvious that Labour were going to win. There's quite a lot of wobbling in the diaries, and there was an enormous amount of wobbling, at the time in the Labour Party of a worry that either the majority might be wafer thin, or that you could even. I mean, there's a point in the diaries where you say, I can see it in Blair's eyes. He knows we're going to lose.
Yes, I tend to err on the side of pessimism, as anyone who's read the diaries will know. Indeed, I was far too pessimistic in the run-up to the 97 election. So it has to be said was Blair. Blair never thought we'd win by more than 20 or 30 seats, and that broadly was my opinion. I know I did predict that we might even lose a week or two beforehand, but that was very temporary and changed the next day. But I never thought we'd win by anything like the margin that we did win by, and neither did Blair. And
almost nobody did they? I don't think anybody predicted.
Well, the polls were saying that for some time, but of course the polls had been proved wrong before. I think they predicted we'd win in 92 as well, and we got smashed. So nobody was relying too heavily on the polls.
It's quite interesting reading these diaries, which they're from 1994 to 99, that some of the resonances, some of the issues that you were so passionately involved with are exactly with us, almost in the same way. You mentioned Murdoch a moment ago, and back then, a big part of your concern was to try and diminish the power of Murdoch. And at some point somebody says to you, don't worry, oh no, you said to him he's only 64. Or he's old, and your interlocutor said, "Oh, he's only 64," and it turns out that he was right. The Murdoch's gone on all the way until now.
Well, the person I was talking to was David Montgomery, who was then the chief executive of Mirror Group newspapers, but had previously worked for Murdoch, I think, as editor of the News of the World. So he was a man in a position to know Rupert. He didn't personally know him, and he said to me in that conversation that Rupert is only happy when he's inflicting pain.
And it might have been, I don't know if it would have been possible to do anything about Murdoch way back then, but it would clearly have been desirable if it had been possible.
Yes, it wasn't just Murdoch. I mean, most of what we see and read is controlled by a handful of rich men and corporations who shamelessly abuse their power. And so, yes, from an early stage, my thinking was that we had to address this issue. Obviously, we've got to address it very cautiously, because if it all goes wrong, they'll turn on you with an even greater ferocity. Even John Major, and there's a very interesting conversation in the diaries with John Major, who says to me that he had looked at confining ownership of the British media to European EU citizens, rather the same way as only Americans can own large chunks of the American media, which is why Murdoch changed from being an Australian to an American. So there was some possibility, an outside possibility of cross-party cooperation, which I think is probably the only way it could be addressed. But it wasn't politically, although I was flagging up the subject from an early stage in the mid-90s, earlier than that perhaps, it was something that could only really be addressed politically now, I would say, because of the implosion of the Murdoch Empire, at least its British arm. It is now politically possible to do something about the great conglomerations of media power in a way that hasn't been in the past. I'm not sure that either party is up for it yet, remains to be seen. Ed Miliband's been making some of the right noises, but I wait to see them translated into action.
Another level of resonance is you end up talking quite a lot about the Nolan Committee on Parliamentary Privileges from back then, which people will remember as the Cash for Questions issue. And of course, that carries on to the parliamentary expenses scandal. Of course, you came out of the expenses scandal quite well, largely because you more or less didn't claim any.
Unscathed. Well, no, I mean, we're all vulnerable, but I had the great good fortune that the Daily Telegraph discovered I still had a black and white TV in my London flat. Not that I was claiming for the TV, you understand, but I was entitled and did claim for the black and white television licence.
Which was all 45 quid, wasn't
45 quid. And so I was one of the tiny percentage of people, a fraction of a percent, who still own a black and white TV set. So that elevated me briefly to the status of sainthood. But I take no comfort from that because it damaged the entire political class, the great expenses meltdown.
But they deserved it, didn't they, Chris? I mean,
the great expenses meltdown, for which you quite rightly say the political classes are to blame, because it's something that should have been dealt with much earlier on, is, however, in a way a triumph for democracy. Because if you look at it now in hindsight, you can see that all the changes that needed making have been made. That is to say, the rules have been tightened. There is now transparency so that people will stop making unjustifiable claims merely because everybody can see what they're up to these days. And in cases of criminality, which there have been a handful, there have been prosecutions. And now there's an entirely new system in place so that none of these abuses can arise in the future. Now, that's democracy working as it should work, in my view. And it's happened in a way, with a minimum of bloodshed, but it's solved the problem, and that's how it should be.
That's expenses. You were always indignant, though, about abuse of privilege. You get very cross in the diaries about committee members wanting to go on lots of trips, and the amount of money that gets spent on foreign junkets, which seems to you to be a waste of public money.
Well, it is a waste of public money, much of it, not all of it, Yes, I mean, the great weakness of the old system was that MPs got to vote on their own wages and their own allowances. Well, that's obviously completely balmy. And year after year, because we were all a bit embarrassed by it, governments would promise that, don't worry, it's all going to be put right, it won't happen again, some new system will be devised, your wages will be linked to some anonymous civil servant and it'll go up or down with his. But none of that ever happened, and I don't know, but I guess we're still in the position where, if not the allowances, at least the salaries may yet be voted on again by Parliament, which is just not right.
When you write diaries, you're offering your judgments as a hostage to fortune. Can I tackle you with one or two and ask you if you still think so? You wrote, perhaps Blair has a plan for government, Gordon doesn't, that's for sure. Was that fair?
Well, I thought Gordon, in opposition, as Shadow Chancellor, which he was for a very long time, was really not very good at it. But when he was Chancellor, actually, he was a far better Chancellor than he was Shadow Chancellor. And he obviously did have some sort of plan, because sort of in the first week he gave, for example, control of exchange rates to the Bank of England, which was widely hailed as a masterstroke. So, and he did actually distribute some wealth, though we all kept rather quiet about it for fear of upsetting the middle classes. And that's, entirely a good thing. So he was a much better Chancellor than it looked at that stage, because you're talking about the mid-1990s, it looked at that stage as though he would be. But of course his big fault as Chancellor is that he bought into the neoliberal idea that of a light-touch regulation of the city and financial institutions. Indeed, annually he went to the City of London and sung their praises in the most embarrassing terms, if you read back, even as late as about 2006 or 7.
We all remember what happened in 2008. Who could have seen that?
The only people not entitled to take advantage of that, of course, are the Conservatives, because their only criticism of Gordon was that the light touch regulation wasn't light enough. Mr. George Osborne was always demanding less regulation and more emulation of the Irish economy even. I mean, it sounds bizarre now, but that's...
It sounded
the same
bizarre
George Osborne
then,
who's now Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Sounded bizarre then to anybody but an ideologue.
Well, Osborne is, of course, an ideologue, unlike Cameron.
Another thing you pronounced on is the minute Labour got into office, Mandelson had the Millennium Dome, and Labour decided to pursue the Millennium Dome project, which you thought was absolutely balmy. And you were right, weren't you?
Well, it wasn't Mandelson's idea. The dome was Michael Heseltine's idea, and he basically sold it to the incoming government. He actually went to see Blair and Co. Before the election and kind of got them to sign up to it. It was one of the first items that came up at the first cabinet meeting, and I think one of the secretaries of the cabinet at that time has since written that possibly the only person in the room who was in favour was the Prime Minister, Mandelson not being a member of the cabinet at that time. But yes, it went ahead anyway, and it did appear to be, yes, a big black pit into which a great deal of public money was chucked, and it was certainly an embarrassment. Everything surrounding it around the Millennium celebration, including the celebration party itself, looked a bit naff to me. Although it has to be said, I think it's worked out reasonably since then. It's been handed over to the private sector, and it's now a concert arena, and it's making somebody some money. But I doubt very much whether it's repaid the public for whatever.
I think you're right.
Invested there. Though it will also have given a boost to regenerating what was a pretty run-down area of Docklands. So when we look back, there's arguments for and against, though at the time it seemed, yes, a complete waste of time to me and many other people besides.
I may have given the impression that it's just unleavened politics, the Diaries, which of course it's not, because you were living your life, you had your family as well. There's a lot of very interesting material about your activities as a constituency MP, which was obviously important to you. There's a conversation you relate with John Pilger in which you say, in the diary, I don't know if you said it to him, but you say, I have a growing feeling that I'm wasting my life. I have to ask, was it worth it, those 23, 24 years in Parliament?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. No, I suppose in any job one has ups and downs, and there were certainly many moments, and as I said before, I tend to err on the side of pessimism, so there were many moments of pessimism when one wondered whether one was wasting one's time or not. But if one looks at it in the round, I think I was useful, but I may be wrong. It's for others to judge. Who knows? My only legacy may be the Diaries.
Well, if they are, that you could do worse than that. The Diaries are they're very entertaining. They're funny as well in their
well, a lot of funny things do happen in politics,
and they're touching. You made me cry with your account of the death of your old
death of Joan
Maynard.
Maynard. Yes, that was a very tragic moment. That really was. Yes, yes, and I had two young daughters, and young children say funny things when they're age 5, 6, 7, 8. Number one daughter thought that all men went to Parliament when she was 5, so she asked me one day why her friend Martha's father always came back from his Parliament every evening. He actually worked in a advice centre in South Shields just down the road, whereas her dad didn't. He went for the week.
and at one point she said she's cross with you. She said, "Daddy, go to London."
No, that's Emma. Emma was 2 when that happened. Of course, she was born in 1995, so their dad always went to Parliament as far as she was concerned. And so she was raiding the sweet jar, and she was dragging a a chair that was bigger than she was across the kitchen floor so she could climb up on it and get into the suites. And she didn't see that I was watching, and when she saw me, she looked at me and said, "Dad, go to London. Go to London, Dad."
Which you mostly had to do. Well, the third volume of Chris Mullin's Diaries, A Walk on Part, is published by Profile Books. It's out now. It's £25. And I think it's £25 well spent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Tim Hague Reads Books, presented by Tim Hague. Tim Hague Reads Books is a Green Shoot production. More details can be found at www.green-shoot.com, or Tim can be contacted on tim@green-shoot.com.